I was paying for a box of medicine at the neighborhood pharmacy when the cashier, an older man in his 60s, suddenly took my arm. His eyes held an intensity that made me uncomfortable, and he leaned in to whisper something in my ear. His words hit me like an unexpected blow, something about my son and his family that left me completely paralyzed. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. The man let go of my arm and continued scanning prescriptions as if nothing had happened, but I stood there, the receipt trembling in my hand, trying to process the words that were now swirling in my head. I walked out the side entrance of the pharmacy. I needed fresh air and time to think. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Was it possible that what this stranger had told me was true? Or was it just a misunderstanding from someone who didn't really know my situation? I decided to hide behind some trash dumpsters near the parking lot. From there, I could observe without being seen. If what I had heard was true, I would soon know it with my own eyes. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 67 years old, and all my life I've worked hard to keep my family together. I live alone in a small apartment downtown on a pension that barely covers the basic bills. Every month I count the dollars several times before deciding what to spend them on, always prioritizing the needs of others before my own. My only son Daniel married Victoria 3 years ago. From the beginning I found her to be a bit distant, but I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, thinking it might just be shyness. Over time, however, I started to notice strange things about her behavior, though I never said anything because I didn't want to create conflict in my son's marriage. Victoria's family had always been very cordial with me, especially her father, Gregory, but there was something in their eyes that didn't sit right with me. They were always talking about how difficult their financial situation was, how they struggled to make ends meet, and without hesitation, I would try to help them when I could. From my hiding spot, I had a perfect view of the pharmacy's main entrance. Daniel was waiting for me in the car, but now I had a clear sight of everything. The cashier's words echoed in my mind over and over again like an unceasing sound. Barely 2 minutes had passed when I saw something that made me doubt everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law's family. Gregory, Victoria's father, walked out the main entrance carrying bags that looked quite heavy. But they weren't ordinary pharmacy bags. They were from a high-end store I only knew by sight, a place I had never had the resources to shop at. The store's name shimmered in gold on the black bags he carried with a casual ease, as if it were a perfectly normal thing for him. My heart began to beat faster. Gregory walked to a car parked just a few feet from where I was hiding. It wasn't the old worn-out car they always complained about when asking for help. It was a brand new, gleaming vehicle, a light color that shone under the afternoon sun. The tires looked brand new and the paint didn't have a single scratch. I watched him open the car's trunk and carefully place the bags inside, like someone protecting something valuable. Then he took out his phone and started talking to someone. Although I couldn't hear the conversation, his body language was relaxed, like that of a person with no urgent financial worries. At that moment, I remembered all the times Victoria had called Daniel asking for help. It was always the same story. They couldn't pay the rent. They needed help with Gregory's medical expenses. They couldn't afford enough food for the week. And my son, with his kind heart, always found a way to send them something. But what I was seeing with my own eyes didn't match those stories of desperate need at all. The expensive bags, the new car, Gregory's relaxed demeanor, everything seemed to completely contradict the version they had been telling us for months. A cold sensation began to spread through my body, like when you sense that something very bad is about to happen. The cashier's words were starting to make sense, though I still resisted believing them completely. Could it be possible that my daughter-in-law's family had been lying to us this whole time? Gregory ended his call and headed back towards the pharmacy entrance. He seemed to be looking for something or someone. His eyes scanned the parking lot carefully, as if to make sure no one had seen him. That cautious attitude seemed very suspicious to me. I decided to stay hidden a little longer. My gut told me there was more to discover, and after what I had seen, I couldn't simply ignore the situation. I needed to be completely sure before I talked to Daniel about this. As I remained hidden, I began to remember how I had gotten to this point. That morning, I had woken up with a mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been months since I had visited Victoria's family, and I wanted to make a good impression by bringing something special to share. I went to my small kitchen and opened the jar where I kept my savings. Counting those coins had become a painful but necessary ritual. I separated the wrinkled bills and coins I had been saving for weeks, sacrificing small pleasures like a coffee at the bakery or a magazine at the newsstand. I had exactly $43. It wasn't much, but I had decided to use 20 of it to buy a decent box of pastries at the neighborhood bakery. The rest I needed for my expenses the next week, mainly to buy my medications and some basic groceries. I showered with care and chose my best dress, the one I saved for special occasions. It was a simple but clean dress that made me feel presentable. I styled my hair, trying to hide the gray strands that were more noticeable every day, and put on the fake pearl earrings my late mother had given me so many years ago. Before leaving, I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I saw a 67-year-old woman who had worked her whole life, who had raised her son alone after being widowed, and who was now trying to keep a family together that seemed to value money more than feelings. Daniel arrived to pick me up exactly on time. My son had always been punctual, a quality I admired in him. When I got in his car, I noticed he seemed a little tense, but I thought maybe it was nervousness about the family visit. During the ride, we talked about unimportant things. He told me about his office job, about some minor problems he'd had with his boss, but he avoided talking about Victoria or her family. That seemed strange to me because he normally kept me informed about how things were going in his marriage. When we arrived at the area where Victoria's family lived, I asked him to stop at the pharmacy. I wanted to buy something sweet to go with lunch. Daniel offered to go in with me, but I told him I preferred to go alone, that I wouldn't be long. The pastry shelf inside the pharmacy had several cakes available. I chose a simple vanilla cake, nothing extravagant but presentable. It cost exactly $18 less than I had budgeted, which made me happy because it meant I could buy a small greeting card. It was also in the checkout line that everything happened. The cashier, a man who seemed to be my age, served me normally until he saw the name on the credit card I tried to use first. The card was rejected as I expected because I knew I didn't have sufficient funds. Then I took out the cash. It was at that moment that the man looked at me more closely, whispered my name, Eleanor Hayes, and asked me if I was Daniel's mother. When I confirmed that I was, his expression changed completely. He looked worried, almost scared. What he told me after grabbing my arm was something I will never be able to forget, though at that moment I refused to believe it. His words were direct and painful. He told me that my daughter-in-law's family came to that pharmacy regularly, spending hundreds of dollars on imported products and premium medicines, while at the same time he knew they were constantly asking my son for money. He explained that he knew the situation, because Gregory had mentioned several times, with a certain pride, how my son helped them financially every month. The cashier, Samuel Pierce, told me he had seen Gregory buy bottles of wine that cost more than I spent on food for a whole week. He also told me that Victoria frequently bought expensive beauty products and designer clothes there, always paying in cash. He told me it seemed unfair that a family who gave themselves those luxuries was taking advantage of the generosity of a hard-working son and his elderly mother. The man explained that he had decided to talk to me because he had seen me carefully counting my coins to pay for a simple cake while they spent, without a care, on luxury items. He told me that his own mother had gone through a similar situation and that he regretted not having acted in time. I was still trembling when I stepped out of the pharmacy, clutching the small box of pastries I had chosen. My heart hadn't slowed since the cashier, that gray-haired man with troubled eyes, leaned close to me and whispered words that shattered the last bit of calm I had left. "Mrs. Hayes, if you are Daniel's mother, you deserve to know what's happening." The way his hand had tightened on my arm, the urgency in his whisper, it was enough to make the blood drain from my face. I tried to steady myself, but inside my chest, something beat like a wild drum. His words accusing my daughter-in-law's family of living in comfort while draining my son's paycheck struck like lightning. I staggered out the side door, afraid my legs might give out. The air smelled faintly of gasoline from the parking lot, but I gulped it in anyway, desperate to breathe. My palms were damp, the receipt shaking in my hand. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 67 years old, a widow for more than 2 decades. I raised my son Daniel alone, worked 3 jobs at times just to keep food on our table. For years, I've lived frugally in a 1-bedroom downtown apartment. Every penny counts. Every coin I save feels like a small victory against the loneliness of old age. And now, a stranger had just told me that the family of my daughter-in-law, Victoria, might be lying to us. I couldn't go back to Daniel's car just yet. Not like this. I had to know more. So I slipped behind the dumpsters at the far end of the pharmacy's lot, the stench of garbage rising in the warm afternoon sun. I pressed my back to the cold brick wall, breath-shallow eyes fixed on the front doors. That was when the dread inside me sharpened into a piercing memory, the letter. Earlier that morning, before Daniel drove me here, I had found an envelope in my mailbox. No name, no return address, just my own written in shaky black ink. I almost tossed it as junk, but something in me insisted I open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 10 words written in block letters. They are not poor. Watch carefully. Protect your son. At the time, I thought it was the cruel prank of some bored neighbor. I tore the page in half, then stuffed it in my handbag without a second thought. But now, crouching behind the dumpsters, Samuel Pierce's whisper still burning in my ear, that anonymous warning returned with a force that made my skin crawl. Fear. Vigilance. A mother's instinct. They braided together in me like barbed wire. Through the pharmacy's glass doors, I finally saw him, Gregory Hale, Victoria's father. He strolled out carrying bags that gleamed with the golden lettering of a store far above anything I could afford. My breath hitched. They weren't medicine bags. They were luxury bags. He walked to a brand new car, not the dented old vehicle they had shown us so many times when begging for help. The paint shone like water, the tires perfect, the chrome catching the sun. My stomach turned. For years they had asked Daniel for rent money, for grocery money, for medicine. And here was Gregory loading treasures into a car that cost more than I had earned in my entire lifetime of double shifts. The anonymous letter's words seared through me. Watch carefully. I did. I watched as Gregory pulled out his phone and laughed, his body relaxed, his voice carrying just enough for me to hear the ease in his tone. No worry. No desperation. Only satisfaction. I pressed myself tighter to the wall. Sweat trickled down my back. My pulse hammered so loudly, I feared he might hear it. And then, as if fate wanted to make certain I could not cling to my old illusions, 2 women walked by pushing shopping carts. They spoke softly, but when they mentioned Victoria's name, my ears sharpened like a fox stalking prey. "Did you see her new dress yesterday?" the first one asked. "It had to be at least $200. The second thinner woman with glasses nodded knowingly. "And she buys those French creams at the mall. My niece works there. Says Victoria is one of their best customers." I nearly gasped out loud. My hands trembled against the brick wall. For years, I had heard Victoria's voice over the phone, trembling with practiced sorrow, telling Daniel they couldn't pay rent, that her father's medical bills were crushing them, that they had no food in the pantry. How many nights had I lain awake worrying, giving up my own medications, just so I could hand her my emergency savings? And yet here, strangers were describing the same woman as a customer in the city's most expensive shops. Fear dug claws into me, but beneath it grew something else, an animal vigilance. My eyes searched for every detail, my ears stretched for every word. Gregory was still there, standing proudly by his car, checking the parking lot as if making sure no one had seen him. When his gaze swept dangerously close to where I hid, I flattened myself against the wall. Heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. That was when the truth became undeniable. The letter, the cashier's warning, the gossiping women, 3 arrows pointing to the same target. My daughter-in-law's family had woven lies so thick they thought no one could ever cut through. but they hadn't counted on a mother's instinct. I knew then that this was only the beginning. I needed more proof, more than whispers and suspicions. Daniel would never believe without evidence. He trusted his wife too deeply, but my mother's gut, screamed danger. The rest of that afternoon passed in a haze of dread. I smiled at my son when I returned to the car, lied about the long line, and carried my cake as if nothing were wrong. But inside, my heart was still racing, my mind already planning how I could uncover the truth. I kept touching my handbag where the torn halves of the anonymous letter still rested. Those 10 words haunted me like a drumbeat. They are not poor. Watch carefully. Protect your son. When I returned to Daniel's car that afternoon, clutching the small vanilla cake, I forced a smile. My son looked at me curiously, but I hid my trembling hands by folding them in my lap. Inside my chest still throbbed with the memory of Samuel Pierce's whisper and the echo of that anonymous letter. I told myself I would act normal. I would breathe, smile, and pretend this was any ordinary family visit. But as we drove toward Victoria's parents' neighborhood, a dread heavier than stone pressed down on me. The houses grew larger, their lawns manicured the hedges, trimmed like soldiers standing at attention. It was not the kind of street where families drowning in debt usually lived. And yet this was where Gregory and his family claimed to be barely surviving. Daniel parked in front of a freshly painted 2-story home with new shutters gleaming in the late afternoon sun. My throat tightened. I remembered Victoria sobbing over the phone last month saying they had to choose between fixing a leaky roof and buying food. But here stood a house that looked like it had just stepped out of a magazine cover. The front door swung open before we could knock. Victoria appeared, her smile wide, her figure framed by the golden lights spilling from inside. She wore a dress of deep emerald green that clung perfectly to her waist. Her hair shimmered with fresh highlights. Her shoes sparkled with the unmistakable sheen of new leather. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as if invisible fingers had closed around my throat. Shock, rage, shame. They all rose together like waves crashing against a cliff. "Eleanor," she exclaimed, wrapping me in a hug perfumed with a fragrance I knew cost more than 2 weeks of my groceries. "What a surprise! Come in, come in. We've been waiting for you." I smiled weakly, but inside, I burned. The living room looked nothing like the modest home I remembered. The old sofa had vanished, replaced by rich leather that smelled new. A crystal chandelier glimmered above us. On the wall hung a flat-screen television so large it dwarfed the room itself. My stomach turned as I imagined the extra shifts Daniel had worked the nights he had fallen asleep with paperwork still in his hands, all to send money here. I sat down carefully, clutching my handbag, close trying to swallow the bitter taste rising in my mouth. Daniel seemed oblivious, chatting happily with Victoria about work and plans for the weekend. My son believed every word she spoke. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Gregory soon emerged from the kitchen apron tied around his waist as though he had spent the day cooking. Yet I had seen him just hours earlier, laughing by his car with luxury bags in his hands. He greeted me warmly, but I saw the flicker of discomfort in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure how much I knew. We moved to the dining table, and there my humiliation deepened. The spread was obscene in its abundance. Roasted meats, salads draped in imported cheeses, bottles of wine I recognized from behind the locked glass cases at the pharmacy. I forced myself to take a bite, but each mouthful felt like swallowing betrayal. As we ate, Victoria launched into stories of hardship, her voice smooth, her eyes wide with practiced sorrow. She spoke of overdue bills of medical expenses, of how grateful they were for Daniel's generosity. And all the while, I stared at the crystal glasses, the polished silverware, the silk drapes fluttering at the window. My anger swelled, but I pressed it down, burying it deep like a fire smoldering underground. I reminded myself, gather proof, not accusations. After lunch, Victoria offered to show me the new curtains in the upstairs bedroom. I followed, forcing my feet to move. My eyes scanned everything. Every detail was a contradiction, every corner another lie. In their study, the door slightly ajar, I noticed something strange. A desk drawer hadn't been closed properly. Papers jutted out, and curiosity pulled me closer. I leaned down and caught sight of them, glossy receipts, invoices from boutiques' delivery slips for imported wine and gourmet catering. One was dated the very week Victoria had called Daniel, crying for rent money. My knees almost gave way. Heat rushed to my cheeks, a shame so deep it made me tremble. I had pawned my late husband's watch once to help them pay that so-called rent. And here, lying casually in a drawer, was proof of their deception. I quickly stepped back as I heard Victoria's footsteps behind me. I plastered a smile on my face, pointing at the curtains. "Lovely," I said faintly. "You have such good taste." But inside, my humiliation churned. For years, I had believed their stories emptied my purse, skipped my medicine. And they must have laughed at my gullibility, at Daniel's devotion, at our sacrifices. I sat through the rest of the visit like a ghost, nodding, smiling, even laughing when expected. But every glance around that house was another dagger, twisting in my chest. By the time we left, night had fallen. The stars above seemed cruelly bright, mocking me. Daniel walked beside me, humming softly, pleased with the evening. I wanted to grip his shoulders and shout the truth, but the words remained locked in my throat. He was too blind with love, too loyal to question. In the car, as the headlights cut through the darkness, I replayed every detail in my mind. The emerald dress, the chandelier, the invoices spilling from that drawer. I felt crushed under the weight of betrayal. Anger coiled in me, but so did humiliation. How could I have been so naive? How had I let them deceive not just my son, but me? And yet, even as shame clawed at me, another feeling stirred resolve. I would gather more proof. I would not speak until I could tear through their web of lies with evidence so solid Daniel could no longer deny it. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity, about justice, about a mother's duty to shield her only child from wolves in disguise. I sat there in silence, clutching the cake box that now felt ridiculous, a symbol of how small my gestures had been against their grand deception. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself a dangerous thought stories like these, the kind you sometimes stumble upon late at night, the kind that get shared under the name Reddit revenge stories. They weren't just online curiosities. They were my life now. My humiliation had become my battlefield, and sooner or later, revenge or justice would have to come. Because families like the Hales thrived on silence, on the politeness of those too ashamed to confront them. But I was done being silent. If you've ever listened to Reddit revenge stories, you know they often begin with betrayal and end with truth revealed. That was where I was headed. And dear listener, if you feel the weight of Eleanor's shame pressing in, if you believe truth deserves light, don't forget to tap that like button. It helps more than you know. That night, after returning from Victoria's home, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. Sleep refused to come. The receipts, the chandelier, the emerald dress, they all swirled together in my mind like a cruel dream. The humiliation of sitting at that table gnawed at me, but what hurt worse was the realization that Daniel had seen none of it. My son had smiled and laughed, his trust unshaken. He still believed his wife's stories. I knew then I couldn't wait any longer. I had to collect proof, real, undeniable evidence. Without it, Daniel would never break free. So the next morning, I made a decision. I would go back. I told Daniel I wanted to deliver a small gift to Victoria's family, just a simple courtesy. He thought nothing of it, kissed my cheek, and left for work. And with my handbag heavy at my side, I set out with trembling determination. When Victoria opened the door, she was surprised but smiled graciously, inviting me inside. My hands were clammy, my pulse racing, but I forced my lips into what I hoped looked like a warm smile. As she went to fetch tea, I slipped quietly toward the study. The drawer I had noticed yesterday was closed, but not locked. With fingers shaking, I pulled it open. There they were, dozens of invoices, receipts, and delivery slips from luxury boutiques, high-end wine merchants, and foreign beauty suppliers. Shock stole my breath. Seeing them yesterday had been enough to plant fury in my chest, but now holding them in my hands, the truth roared through me like fire. These weren't isolated purchases. This was a pattern, a life of indulgence, funded by my son's sacrifices. And then another discovery. Folded beneath a stack of receipts was an envelope filled with crisp $100 bills. My throat closed. How many times had Daniel skipped dinner to send them rent money while this envelope sat here untouched? Tears stung my eyes, but my fury burned hotter. I pulled my phone from my handbag and began snapping photos. Each click of the camera felt like a heartbeat, like proof gathering weight in my hand. Just then, footsteps echoed in the hall. I froze. The doorknob rattled. Victoria's voice floated in, "Eleanor, are you lost?" Panic surged. I stuffed the papers back into the drawer, shoved my phone into my bag, and pushed the drawer shut just as the door opened. Victoria's eyes flickered with suspicion, but her smile quickly returned. "There you are. I thought you might have wandered off." My lips curved in a faint smile, though my palms were drenched in sweat. "I was just admiring your lovely curtains," I lied. She tilted her head, studying me. For a heartbeat, I feared she knew. But then she laughed lightly and beckoned me back toward the kitchen. I followed, my chest tight, my hands trembling. But inside, a fire raged. I now had evidence. I had photographs. I had enough to finally open Daniel's eyes. That evening, back in my apartment, I sat at the table scrolling through the images. Every receipt, every invoice, every dollar bill I had captured it all. The proof was solid. Still, my heart ached. This wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal. It was about the dignity stolen from me when I pawned my husband's watch to help them pay a bill that never existed. It was about the nights Daniel had fallen asleep at his desk after endless overtime while his in-laws drank champagne in crystal glasses. Shock still gripped me. Fury now roared louder, and rising beneath it was a resolve so sharp it cut through my fear. I would confront the truth. The very next day, I asked Daniel to come over after work. He arrived weary but smiling, carrying a bouquet of daisies for me. My heart squeezed. He had always been that kind of son, thoughtful, gentle. How I hated the storm I was about to unleash upon him. We sat together at my small kitchen table, the daisies between us and a jar of water. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. "Daniel," I began softly, "I need to show you something, and I need you to look with open eyes no matter how much it hurts." He frowned, puzzled. "Mom, what's this about?" I unlocked my phone, scrolled to the photos, and slid it across the table. His eyes narrowed as he leaned in. Receipt after receipt, invoice after invoice, the envelope of $100 bills. At first his brow furrowed in confusion. Then his mouth parted, the color draining from his face. Where did you get these?" he whispered. "I found them yesterday. I went back today. These are from Victoria's family. This is where your money has gone." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Only the hum of the refrigerator broke it. Then Daniel shoved back his chair and stood hands braced on the table, eyes wide in disbelief. "No," he said hoarsely. "No, this can't be right." "She told me she lied," I interrupted, my voice steady, though my heart raced. "Son, she lied to you, and to me. All of those nights, all of those sacrifices, you were feeding their indulgence, not their need." He staggered back a step, one hand over his mouth. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his face ashen. "I've been a fool," he whispered. "No," I said softly, standing and placing a hand on his arm. "You've been a good man, a generous man. They took advantage of your goodness. But now you know the truth, and the choice is yours." He sank back into the chair, trembling. Shock gripped him, but I saw the fury beginning to kindle in his eyes. This was the turning point, the moment when betrayal would either destroy him or ignite his resolve, and I knew which it would be, because Daniel Hayes was my son. This, dear listener, is where stories like mine shift from humiliation into a fight for justice. You've probably come across Reddit family tales before where a mother or a father finally unmasks deception. That's exactly where I stood now. I sat with Daniel long into the night, watching as disbelief gave way to rage and rage gave way to resolve. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight, and finally he whispered, "They will never take another dime from me." And in that moment, I knew the tide had turned. Stories like these, the kind people share on Reddit family tales, are not just stories. They are warnings, and sometimes they are roadmaps to courage. And let me ask you before I continue, is this voice drawing you in? If not, press 0. If very much, press 1. The next evening, Daniel returned to his home with a storm brewing inside him. The photographs I had shown him were still burned into his mind. He barely slept the night before, tossing and turning, replaying every sacrifice he had made while his in-laws dined on luxury. I stayed awake too, pacing my apartment, clutching my rosary like a lifeline. I had given my son the truth, but now he had to face it directly. I feared what would come, yet I knew it was necessary. When Daniel stepped through the front door of his own house, the smell of perfume greeted him sharp and sweet. Victoria appeared at the top of the stairs dressed in a silken blouse and new earrings that caught the light. She smiled, but her smile faltered when she saw the look in his eyes. "Daniel," she asked cautiously. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. He walked past her into the living room, placed his briefcase on the table, and pulled out the stack of printed photographs I had given him earlier. His hands trembled as he spread them across the coffee table. "Explain these," he said in a low voice. Victoria's eyes flickered. For a moment, the mask cracked, but she quickly recovered. "What is this receipts anyone could have?" "Don't," he cut her off sharply, his voice trembling. "Don't insult me with more lies. These are from your father's drawer. These are the invoices from the boutiques, the wine shops, the deliveries. And this," he lifted the photo of the envelope filled with cash. "This is what you called desperate times." Victoria's face hardened. She crossed her arms and tilted her chin upward. "You had no right to go through our things. Your mother put these ideas in your head, didn't she? She's always hated me." Daniel's chest rose and fell as if each breath were a battle. "Stop blaming my mother. This isn't about her. This is about you, about your family, about the lies you've told me for 2 years. Her eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. My father's health, enough." His voice cracked like thunder, and for a moment the house went still. "Don't you dare use that excuse again. I have the dates. I have the receipts. The same day you begged me for money to pay for his medicine, you bought French champagne. Do you know how many nights I skipped meals to cover your so-called emergencies?" Victoria's lips pressed together, her eyes glittering with defiance. "We did what we had to do to keep this family afloat." Daniel's face twisted with anguish. "Keep this family afloat or keep your closets full and your wine glasses brimming." His voice broke heavy with betrayal. "I trusted you, Victoria. I built my life around you. And all this time, I was nothing more than a paycheck." The tension in the room was unbearable, like a string pulled to the point of breaking. For the first time, Victoria's eyes wavered. Her hand clutched at her handbag resting on the couch. Daniel's gaze followed. Something in her sudden protectiveness sparked suspicion. He reached for the bag, but she tried to pull it away. They struggled for a brief moment until the strap slipped and the handbag spilled open across the couch. Among the lipstick tubes, receipts, and a compact mirror lay a small notebook, leather-bound and worn at the edges. Daniel picked it up with trembling hands. "What is this? Give it back!" Victoria snapped, her voice sharp with panic, but Daniel had already opened it. His eyes scanned the pages and his blood ran cold. Each line was meticulous. Dates, amounts, fabricated emergencies. March 12th, car repair, $500. April 3rd, medical tests for father, $300. May 9, rent overdue, $600. Every plea, every tearful phone call, every desperate story, it was all there written down like business transactions. His chest tightened, a pain so sharp he thought he might collapse. The woman he loved, the woman he vowed to share his life with, had been orchestrating his exploitation, like a banker keeping ledgers. This is your plan. His voice was barely a whisper, strangled by disbelief. You wrote it all down. Every lie, every trick. Victoria's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The silence was deafening. Finally, Daniel closed the notebook with a trembling snap. His eyes filled with tears, not of sadness alone, but of devastation. His trust had been shattered into dust. I was your husband, he said hoarsely, not your victim. Victoria tried to reach for him, her voice breaking into a sob. Daniel, please, you don't understand. We needed no. His roar echoed through the room. You wanted. You schemed. You wrote it all down like I was nothing but a bank account. There's no misunderstanding here. Only betrayal. He dropped the notebook on the table as though it burned his hand. His chest heaved, his eyes rimmed with red. In that moment, the weight of 2 years collapsed upon him. The long nights at work, the money he had sent, the sacrifices he had made, and all of it, every dollar, every moment, built upon lies. The tension strangled him. The heartbreak carved through his chest, and the trust he had once carried so easily now lay broken at his feet. I don't even know who you are anymore, he whispered. Victoria sank to the floor, sobbing, clutching at his legs, but Daniel pulled free. His heart had cracked open, and what spilled out was not love but anguish. I can't do this, he said, not one more day. He walked out the front door, slamming shut behind him. When he arrived at my apartment later that night, I saw in his face what I had feared. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes red, his steps heavy. He looked like a man who had seen the ruins of his own life laid bare. Mom, he whispered as I opened the door. It's worse than we thought. I guided him inside, sat him down, and he told me everything. The notebook, the lies, the confrontation. As I listened, my own heart ached. The tension of his voice, the sharp pain in his words, the broken pieces of his trust, all of it wrapped around me like barbed wire. I wanted to cry, to rage, to strike out at those who had used him, but I knew what he needed most was a steady hand, a mother's love, and the assurance that he was not alone. I placed my hand over his. Son, you've lost trust, but you haven't lost yourself. That strength you feel breaking inside, that's the beginning of freedom, and no matter what comes next, I will stand with you. He closed his eyes, and for the first time that night, he let himself weep. And as I held him, I knew our lives had reached a breaking point. The trust was gone, the wound was deep, and the road ahead would be long. But at least finally, the truth was undeniable. The days after Daniel's confrontation with Victoria were like wandering through a wasteland. He drifted between my apartment and his office, hollow-eyed, barely eating. The notebook he had discovered lay heavy in his memory, its pages etched into his mind like scars he could not erase. As his mother, I watched helplessly. I could not repair the damage for him. I could only hold him, feed him soup, and remind him that despair was not the end, but the beginning of clarity. Yet even with my reassurances, I could see his despair was bottomless. His trust, once his anchor was gone. He had built his marriage on the belief that honesty and love were enough. Now he stood in ruins, asking himself if he had ever truly known his wife at all. One night, sitting across the table from me, Daniel whispered, "Mom, I feel like my whole life was stolen. Every paycheck, every hour of overtime, I worked for lies. Tears burned in my eyes, but I did not let them fall. Instead, I took his hand. Son, what you lost was poisoned from the start. Better to see the truth, now painful as it is, than to let the poison keep spreading. The next morning, Daniel called a lawyer. The decision was made. Divorce was no longer an option to consider, it was a necessity. The process began swiftly, but each step uncovered new wounds. The lawyer requested financial records, and that was when the hidden truth surfaced. Victoria had a bank account in her name alone. In it sat over $30,000 quietly accumulated over the course of the marriage. When Daniel heard the figure, he staggered back in the lawyer's office as if struck. $30,000, he repeated, his voice breaking. While I scraped together rent, while I pawned my watch to cover her father's surgery that never happened, she was hiding $30,000. The lawyer nodded grimly. We'll use this in court. It proves deliberate deception. I was sitting beside my son, and I felt his despair cave inward into something darker shame. His head dropped into his hands. I've been such a fool. I reached across the polished table and gripped his shoulder. No, son. You've been a good man who trusted too much. That is not foolishness, it's humanity. The shame belongs to her, not you. But still, the despair lingered. It pressed on him every night as he tried to sleep, and it whispered in his ears as he signed papers to dismantle a marriage that had never been what it seemed. The day of the first court hearing arrived. Daniel wore a dark suit, his face pale but resolute. I sat in the back row, clutching my rosary, praying for strength, for him, for me, for justice. Victoria entered with her father, Leonard, both of them dressed as if they were stepping into a gala, not a courtroom. She kept her chin high, though her eyes avoided Daniel's. When the judge reviewed the evidence, the notebook, the photographs, and finally the bank records, the silence in the courtroom was thick. Victoria's lawyer tried to argue that the money was a safety fund, but the judge's expression told us all what he thought of that excuse. For Daniel, hearing the numbers aloud was another blade through his chest. Each dollar represented a piece of trust, ripped away each entry in the ledger, a reminder of the years he had poured into a bottomless pit. By the time the session ended, he walked out into the sunlight with shoulders slumped, his despair as visible as his shadow. But something shifted that afternoon. As we sat on the courthouse steps, Daniel stared at the sky for a long time, then said softly, "Mom, I think I've reached the bottom. And maybe that means the only way left is up." That night, I saw the first flicker of release in him. He packed the last of his belongings from the house he once shared with Victoria. He boxed up photographs, clothes, small tokens of a marriage built on sand. At one point, he picked up the wedding album. For a moment he froze, staring at the smiling faces, the vows that now seemed like mockery. Then with a long exhale, he set it aside. "Not everything in this book is a lie," he said softly, "but enough of it is that I can't carry it anymore." I watched as he placed the album in the trash bag, his face both broken and relieved. That was the moment the chains began to fall. The weeks stretched into months, and slowly the despair loosened its grip. He still carried scars. Trust shattered cannot be rebuilt overnight, but each day he grew lighter. The hidden bank account, the notebook, the lies, they had crushed him, but they also freed him. He no longer had to wonder if he was enough or if he was doing too little. He had given everything, and it had never been about him. Now he was free to live without the endless burden of manipulation. "Mom," he said one evening as we sat together in my kitchen, the smell of chicken soup filling the air. "It feels like I've been released from a prison I didn't even know I was in. Painful, yes, but freeing." I smiled through my tears. That's exactly what it is, a breaking of chains. Looking back, I realized despair had been necessary. He had to drown in it, feel the full weight of betrayal before he could rise again. And when he did, the release was powerful, like a man breaking through a locked door and finally breathing the open air. His marriage had ended, but his life had not. In fact, it had just begun. And as his mother, I carried my own release. The guilt I had borne for months, wondering if I should have spoken sooner, if I could have saved him. More pain began to fade. because in the end he had seen the truth with his own eyes, and he had chosen freedom. That night, as I sat alone in my armchair, I whispered a prayer of gratitude, for strength, for truth, for the shattered chains that now lay at my son's feet. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least it was his road, not one dictated by lies and manipulation. Despair had nearly broken him. Trust had collapsed entirely. But in that collapse, he had found release. And in that release, he would find life again. The months that followed the divorce were unlike anything Daniel or I had ever lived through before. For a long time, silence filled the spaces where noise and tension had once thrived. The phone no longer rang with urgent demands for rent money, fabricated medical bills, or last-minute crises. Instead, there was quiet, an almost sacred stillness that wrapped itself around our lives like a blanket. At first, that silence felt strange, even unsettling. After years of constant pressure and manipulation, the absence of it was almost disorienting. But gradually, it became a gift. Daniel moved into a small apartment just a few blocks from mine. It wasn't much 2 rooms, modest furniture, the hum of traffic outside his window, but it was his. No more walking into a home where lies lingered in the curtains. No more waiting for the next fabricated emergency. This space, however humble, was his sanctuary. One evening, I visited him with a pot of stew and freshly baked bread. We sat at his little kitchen table, the window cracked open to let in the cool breeze. For the first time in years, I saw his shoulders relax. He wasn't smiling broadly yet, but the sharp lines of exhaustion and fear had softened. "Mom," he said quietly, "I feel like I can breathe again." That sentence alone was enough to make my eyes well with tears. It was the essence of everything I had prayed for: his release, his peace, his rebirth. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began rebuilding piece by piece. He opened a savings account of his own. He started eating better, even treating himself occasionally to meals he once denied himself. He bought a used bicycle and began cycling through the park on weekends, rediscovering the joy of simple, honest pleasures. Watching him heal was like watching winter melt into spring. At first, the signs were small, a lighter step, a gentler laugh, but then came brighter moments. He began to dream again. One afternoon, he told me, "I want to buy a house someday, Mom. Not a mansion, just a little place with a yard. Somewhere that's truly mine." It was more than a dream, it was a declaration. He was no longer the man chained to false obligations. He was a man rediscovering his worth, his purpose, and his future. The community around us seemed to recognize the transformation too. Neighbors who once pitied him for being endlessly drained by Victoria's family now nodded with respect. He had chosen dignity over deception, truth over illusion. Even I found myself changing. For months, guilt had weighed me down, guilt that I hadn't spoken up sooner, guilt that I had allowed my son to suffer in silence. But as I watched him rise, that guilt gave way to pride. I realized something profound: my silence had not been weakness, but waiting. I had waited until the evidence was undeniable, until the truth could stand on its own legs. And when the moment came, I had acted. There is a deep quiet that comes from knowing you did what was right, even when it was hard. That was the quiet I carried now. 2 years later, Daniel remarried. His new wife, Regina, was everything Victoria was not: transparent, hardworking, respectful. She never asked for money. She never made excuses. She simply loved him for who he was. I will never forget the evening she came to my apartment for dinner. She walked in carrying a basket of vegetables and said, "Adeline, I thought we could cook together." It was such a small gesture, yet it pierced my heart. In that moment, I knew Daniel had finally found what true partnership looked like: honesty, simplicity, love without strings. When Regina placed her hand over mine at the dinner table and said softly, "I will never ask you or Daniel for what I can't earn myself," I had to excuse myself to the kitchen for a moment. Tears fell freely down my cheeks. They were tears not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Now as I sit in my armchair writing these reflections, I hear Daniel and Regina laughing in the kitchen, preparing a meal together. The sound is music to me, pure, untainted, alive with hope. Soon they will welcome their first child, and I will hold my grandchild in my arms. That child will never know the hunger of lies or the weight of manipulation. That child will grow up in a home where trust is real and love is unbroken. And that to me is redemption. To those of you listening now, especially those who are parents or grandparents, there is a lesson here that goes beyond my family's story. It is this: generosity without wisdom can become a trap. Trust without boundaries can become a prison. But when truth is faced, even if it shatters illusions, it also sets us free. We must never confuse love with submission to lies. True love stands on honesty. True generosity walks hand in hand with discernment. And true peace comes not from avoiding conflict, but from confronting it with dignity. If you take nothing else from my story, take this: it is never too late to be brave. It is never too late to protect the people you love. And it is never too late to begin again. To each of you who has listened to these words, I want to thank you. Thank you for walking with me through despair, through heartbreak, and now into hope. Thank you for giving me your time, your attention, and your open heart. If this story has touched something in you, if it reminded you of the strength that still lives inside you, I invite you to join me again. Subscribe for more stories that speak to truth and resilience. Leave a comment to share your thoughts, or simply press that like button, so I know you're here, standing with me. And don't forget to watch the next video, because the stories we share together are what give us strength to face our own lives with courage. From my heart to yours, thank you.